very, very much. I mean, you guys are just so full of energy and, and welcoming that it's just great to be here. So thanks for having me. I think when I talk to people, and as writers, we talk to people. We find out what they're up to, and people will tell us stories. At least I found that. When you sit down with somebody and you tell them you're a writer, they'll tell you about some event or something that happened to them. As I started, when I started writing books, and now that I've, been writing books for, 10 or 15 years now, I found that everybody has a story. Even when you get on an airplane, the person sitting next to you in the seat next to you has a story. The person that you meet at a dinner party has a story. Someone that you sit next to in church has a story. Everybody has something, a story that's really interesting. And often that story is sort of like a little jewel that they remember in quite vivid detail. It might be something that happened to them, something that happened to their mother or father or grandmother. It might be something that they read about, but somehow it just stuck. And that's what happened to me in writing this book, Night Flight, which was something that happened when I was about 13, maybe. I was kind of a clueless kid back then. But it was the bombing of a United Airlines plane out of Denver, the Denver airport. And it was the first airplane bombing in U.S. history. And everybody's forgotten about it nowadays. But as I was writing the book, they decided to do a 70th anniversary memorial to that event, honoring those that were killed in that plane crash. Everyone died in it. Excuse me. All right. A little bit more?
That's good.
Okay, good. All right, good. In a sugar beet field north of Denver. And I wasn't even aware of it happening at the time. What I do remember was that the bomber's family, who went to my church, the bomber and his family went to my church. I didn't know them. What I do remember is that after the bomber was caught and executed, they did it fast back in those days, that the family changed their name and no one ever heard from them again. And it wasn't like I thought about it every week, but I did think about it often. And there may be things that you remember or things that you heard someone tell you that kind of stick with you. And so I'm going to talk today about 3 other writers in addition to my own book who kind of did that same thing and how they turned it into fiction. And I'll just bring the books up here and we'll talk a little bit about them. The first book is called Beautiful Ruins, and it's by Jeff Walters. And Jeff Walters, he's a screenwriter, and I think he's written some other books. But this one I thought was particularly interesting because it was about it was set in 1962, and it's about during the era when Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were working on the movie Cleopatra in Italy, and it was extremely newsworthy at the time. There was adultery going on. Both of them were married to somebody else, and he set the book in this era, and he quotes Richard. He made up things scenes with Richard Burton, which of course may or may not have been true. But that's this one. Jess apparent, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Excuse me. The second one is written by somebody who lives in Davis, and she won a prize for historical fiction. And when she was, I'm not sure how old she was, I think she was a teacher at the time, and a second cousin of hers called to tell her that they had found a series of stories in a 1903 copy of a Kansas newspaper about one of her ancestors who had been an indentured servant in the Carolinas back in the early part of the 18th century. And she decided to write a book about it and did an amazing amount of research, and it's very, very interesting. And I'll talk a little bit more about that one in a little bit. The third one is a book called The Dakota Winters by Tom Barbash. And Tom Barbash is a Bay Area author. And this is not about coal times in the Great Plains. It's about a family living in the famous apartment complex, the Dakota, in New York City, where John Lennon lived, and Joe Namath, and Lauren Bacall, and other famous folks. And he set this there during the era when John Lennon died. So those are three, and in each of these, they created and they took these characters and created and wrote, stuff about them that may or may not have been true. Some of it was, but they took these events that meant something to them and wrote a novel about it. Now I'm going to talk just a little bit more about how they came about doing that. In the first one, and why it kind of stuck with them. Now the first one, Beautiful Ruins, Jess Walter went to Italy with his wife to Cinque Terre on the Ligurian Sea, and where, a very, as you folks may know, a very famous touristy place, right along the rocky cliffs and coast of northwestern Italy. And apparently he had a great time there because he remembered it very vividly. And that's why he began writing this book. Now, Jess Walter said why he decided to set it in the 1960s, I don't know, because the affair between Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor happened in 1962, and he decided to set it there. He has a young man, kind of a lonely young guy, who's starting a hotel there. It's not a successful hotel. He's kind of lonely, and a beautiful young woman arrives on a boat, and that's how it starts. Now, Walter said that as he wrote the book, Richard Burton became more and more of a character and spread more and more into the life of this book, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so he made up scenes with Richard Burton. Richard Burton eventually also washes up on this shore. Also washes up on this shore. So that was Beautiful Ruins and how he started out doing that.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Okay.
And I will move over a little bit so I'm not knocking it. Now, Dorothea, when she started this book, she was going to write about and have it be the story about the young white indentured servant who was part of her family. But she got started working on the era in which he lived in the Carolinas, where large and prosperous plantations were owned by wealthy black families. And she was like kind of astounded to know that. And those black families had black slaves. When she found out about that, she focused on a young black teenager growing up in a wealthy family on one of these plantations. And the young man, the young indentured servant, is not the center of the story. She builds the story around the culture that is rapidly disintegrating, where black people could own and operate these very prosperous rice plantations. And so she didn't make him be the young indentured servant be the focus of the story, but he saves the beautiful girl in the end. And he's young. He's like 14 or something at the time. So that's how she approached it. So that's a different way of approaching it. He wasn't, And in the other one, Richard Burton was also not the main focus or the protagonist in this book, but his influence kind of spread throughout it. Now, in the Dakota Wind, now I'll talk a little bit about my book next, because I read a couple of books about this incident before I started on it, and I was interested because the family went to my church. And the more I researched it, the more I found kind of eerie little details that sort of, the event kind of washed around me in a way. For example, okay. All right. Yeah, thank you. For example, the minister at our church was very involved in counseling both the perpetrator, whose name was John Gilbert Graham, and Graham's family during the whole time when he was questioned by the FBI and when he was arrested. And that minister, Reverend Kellums, was mentioned in numerous books, so I could use his real name in that. And but Reverend Kellums was a great guy. I knew him. He baptized me when I was 9 years old, and he was the one that was involved with the family like 4 years later when this all happened. And so that was one thing that really drew me to it. And the more I wrote about it, I guess, the more I was kind of drawn in. And what I did in my book was to have alternating chapters between a young girl who's about 17 or 18 at the time in high school, and John Gilbert Graham himself. And so so the perpetrator was actually an active part of the book. He was one of the two main characters really in the book. And the book, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but the book is really about the journey of Hannah, the young girl. But John Gilbert Graham is very much there in every other chapter. And when I started writing it, I didn't know exactly how I was going to set the book up. I didn't know, because I didn't want the book to end with him blowing up everyone, and then, that's not a good arc for the story, and it's not something that people want to read. But I did remember about Tom Barbash's book, in which a young man named Anton has come back from an unsuccessful trip in the Peace Corps, comes back to New York City. He's not feeling very good. He's a little bit at odds with his family. But in the book, his family lives at the Dakota. And John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono are also living in the Dakota. And so he includes John. And so what Barbash did was include his character, Anton, and John Lennon in a whole milieu of what was going on then in New York City, which was that there were a lot of attacks on the subway. There was the constant crowds around the entrance to the Dakota because of John Lennon being there. And so he sets that all up. And I saw what he did in this book was to create a family story about Anton's family, and how Anton interacted with John Lennon. And some of the interactions with John Lennon are mostly fictional, but one part of it is something that John Lennon actually did, and he interviewed someone about that. So I thought, okay, I could create a family situation in which the arc of the story, the crime included the arc of that story, and the real event included the arc of the story with the family. And so that's how I just, using Barbash's idea on how to do this, Anton and his family, how they interacted with each other, so I used that as kind of a model for how I would structure my book. And as you see, people did it in all different ways. Not everybody did it the same. For Jess Walter, while Richard Burton was kind of a malevolent part of the story. He wasn't the center of it. His tentacles kind of went out, and then Dorothea, whose character was toward the end of the story, and she used what she had found out. So those are some ways in which you could take that piece, that memory, that thing that that you remember, and it's so vivid. And there's just some ways you could make it into a story. And the next time I'm going to talk about, and I've talked about it a little, is about, okay, you have an idea for it, you've got your characters, how are you going to make this happen? And what you need to do in the story, if you're going, and what I did in this story, in which I kind of copied how Barbash worked at it, was I had an arc for your main character. And in this, the arc of the main character is Hannah, the girl. She encounters John Gilbert Graham. He lures her into being kind of on the periphery of what happened. She tries to alert someone. No one will listen to her because she knows something bad is about to happen. No one will listen to her. And after the crash, she has to reconnect with her family. Her family's kind of a mess. She has to reconnect with her family and create a life for herself. And that was how I worked on not having this be, just a terrible thing about this crazy guy, doing this, but about something hopeful where she is able to come back from that event and make a life for herself. And that's the arc of the story. And in the Dakota Winters and in these other books, there is that same arc where you're taking your main character and creating an arc for them. What happens to them? How do they rebuild? How do they react? Now, in Jess Walters' book, it's not super happy. I mean, the young man and the beautiful woman that washed up on the shore, she's actually carrying Richard Burton's baby. And they meet for a short time. They are never lovers, but he remembers her. And when his wife dies many years later, he sets out to find her and find out about her. and he comes to her during the last year of her life. So it's not a super happy one, but there is a feeling of completion about it. Not necessarily that everybody's going to live happily ever after, because the beautiful and young actress doesn't live very long. But you do get the feeling of completion about it, that they do come together again, that he and she both do find some completion of what happened so long ago. Okay, let's talk a little bit now about setting. And I love setting. Some people say, oh, there's too much setting in this. And I know that's true, but that my heart's, a lot of my heart is in setting. I love it. And in this book, Night Flight, I grew up in Denver, so I thought I knew all about it. But when I went back, and I hadn't lived there for a long time, not since I was in my 20s, but I went back several times and revisited the places. One of the places that I revisited was John Gilbert Graham's house, which is still there. I don't think anybody is living in it, but it had a very bad feeling about it. It wasn't like falling down or anything, but it just had a certain vibration about it that just, I got it, that a bad person had lived there. And it was a very strong feeling, and I'm so glad I went. I'm so glad I went and looked at that house. In other books that I've written, certain details that you turn up are just like gold. And so what you can do about setting, feet on the ground is the greatest way to do it. And sometimes you can't do that. But there are lots of other ways of doing it. I love YouTube. You can go to YouTube and look at just about anything. In my book, Bakersfield Boys Club, I had my character going up the Kern Canyon, and I found a YouTube video of a motorcycle guy riding up Kern Canyon on his motorcycle and filming it the whole way with a GoPro on his helmet. So there are, I'll have some handouts for you later on that'll talk a little bit more about setting, but there are all kinds of ways to do it. You can do memoir. Sometimes they have good details about setting. Photographs, and so those are some ways that you can use setting. One of the great things about setting is often you can take something from your setting that will affect your character and make your character and tell you something about the character. If you go someplace and it's smoky, or whatever, and the character smells that smoke and it reminds me of something bad that happened to him, or somebody smells a dish, that someone cooks and which reminds them of something. So there, something rough, or that they touch, or a aspen tree. Aspen trees are great in Colorado. If the aspen trees are turning, that can remind you about your character about something. So one of the great things about setting is that it does give you a chance to have your character interact with the setting in ways that reveal who he is as a person. I love setting, you guys. It's really fun. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about who the characters are. You're never quite sure who the main. Sometimes you're not sure who the main character is going to be. I think Jess Walter in his book, I don't think he was necessarily sure who the main character was going to be, but you have to start out. And as you start out and write, you'll find out who that character is. Sometimes it's not the one you thought it was. But just keep writing, and that will open up. And it will also open up ways that you can build your character. You can make your character fuller, give it more depth. If you just start out writing, your character, it will come. Now in Night Flight, my character Hannah, I started writing about her, and I realized that the character I had as her mother, no, she's got a stepmother. And that just came up as I was writing. I thought, oh, no, she's really in bad shape here. You know, she's lonely, she's not getting along at school, she's got a stepmom, and her mom died. So that didn't happen, you know, early on as I wrote about her, because every character, you know, your main character has got to be in terrible trouble. And so, you know, and then they've got to be in more terrible trouble later on. And so what I did was to make Hannah be someone that's getting into terrible trouble. And why would she do that? Because she has a bad family situation. So that's a way of working with your characters, because the more you write them, the more depth you get with them. And more characters will come up as you write. Say, oh gosh, how about this? I can have this person or that person come. One of the characters in my book is an kind of a lovable but alcoholic former tennis player, and you know, she just kind of came up as I was writing, and she turned out to be a really interesting character in the book, and somebody that kind of helped Hannah on her journey toward putting her life back together. So these are ways that you can work your characters. You can help, just dive in and keep writing. Sometimes if you're stuck, just say, what would this character do? Write down 10 things, and even if it's the craziest thing you never thought of, and one of those things is going to be the thing that character should do. Now I want to talk a little bit about research. And research, you guys, you probably all know how much fun research is. I mean, it is fun. And especially up here, where there's so much history in this area, research is a blast. And when I researched this book, I started out, before I started writing, in reading a couple books about the crash. One of which I read 2 books about it that were, one of which was heavily annotated. That was helpful. I also read the FBI report about the crash and about the investigation, and that was very, very helpful. Then I knew that the perpetrator, John Gilbert Graham, had I didn't want to make him into a monster. I mean, he was a monster because he never showed any remorse. But having a character who's just a complete monster, somehow for me, just didn't work. And so I went back into his background. They had mentioned it in one of the books I read. And his father had died, and I think it was his mom's second husband had died. It was Graham's dad. She put him in an orphanage, and she put Graham's half-sister into a really, really nice boarding school. And when his mom remarried, she took the daughter back, but she never took him back. She left him there. And I decided to see if I could find out more about that orphanage. I went to the Denver Public Library, and they had a section where a research section to help me, and most libraries do. And I found out about a place that librarians go, but the general public doesn't go, called EBSCO. And EBSCO is a huge trove of digitized documents. Millions and millions of documents go there. People from hospitals, from everything you can imagine, send their documents there. And a report about that orphanage had been written back in the 1960s, about 10 years after Graham was there. But I couldn't get a hold of it because it had been digitized, and the national organization that did the study on that orphanage didn't keep it. The library found it for me and sent it to me online. And it revealed that it was a very, very bad place. My brother and I went there. The buildings are still there. My brother and I went there back when I was researching the book. But that was a piece that I never could have gotten otherwise, that I got from the library. Those gals were so wonderful, and I'll tell you another story about them in a little bit. Another way that you can do research is memoir. Just scan the internet for memoir about the place or about the period or the time that you want. Memoir is a great way. Interviews. People love to talk. As a reporter, I know that. But, if you're interested and you're gentle about talking to people, people love to talk. Interview somebody about this, whatever it is that you're writing about. Somebody who knows a lot about it, somebody who knew the person or was there when your real event happened. Those people love to talk, and it's a great way to gain information. In my first book, I ran across somebody who was doing their doctorate on the setting that I had, and he gave me some terrific information. But I never would have if I hadn't just started talking to people. It's just wonderful. Census records are great. You can find out where somebody lived, what their profession was, how old they were, whether they were born in the United States or not, what year it was that they lived in that place. It's great. And that's not hard to do. You can just go right on. Business directories. Okay, now I'm going to tell you a story. When I originally started researching Night Flight, one of the books that I read, and when I reread it, because I had to read it a couple times, when I reread it, I saw that one of the people that testified at the trial, at John Gilbert Graham's trial, was, and you couldn't see her face because the photographer she was turned away from the photographer, but the caption said that her name was Annie Mary Teal. And I thought, no, this can't be that person. And I thought, so I went to the library and I asked them if they could find out more about this. And so they pulled up the census records for that period of time. And it turned out that it was the person that I had thought it was, which is my next door neighbor. And my next door neighbor was testifying at the trial because she inadvertently had sold the timer to John Gilbert Graham that he put on the bomb that blew up the plane. That's the kind of thing that, but I never would have been able to do that if the library hadn't helped me. They got the business directory. It showed that she worked at that company that sold the timer. I said, well, yeah, but I always thought, this lady, she was the nicest lady. I always thought her name was Anna Mary. And they said, well, I don't know, we'll find out. They went back in census records, and they found census records for a couple of census periods. And yes, it was the same person because she was married to Charlie Teal, who's our next door neighbor, and so it was the same person. So here it was. I was living next door, and this didn't happen until I wrote the book, until the library helped me in doing the research, which was, here the person who lived next door to me was the one who, poor lady, I never knew about it. I don't know. My parents ever knew about it. I don't know. but she was the one who sold him the timer. And it was one of the pieces of evidence that they were able to recover that showed that this was how the bomb had been detonated. So you guys, talk to your library. They're terrific. They're just terrific. The things that they can find out for you that will make your life easier as far as a writer, it's just amazing. They're terrific. So that's kind of where I was going with this. One of the things I'm going to do afterward is I'm going to pass out a packet with some of the information that I've shared with you today, so that you'll be able to take a look at it, and maybe I'll give you some, an idea or encouragement, on your next thing. And the last thing I want to talk about is libel. And that is, okay, you're writing about real... Yeah, we're writing about real people. Real people. And how can you protect yourself in writing about real people? Well, the one thing you have to bear in mind is that you can't libel dead people. So, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor and John Lennon, and those people cannot be libeled. They're dead. When George Sanders wrote the book about Lincoln and the Bardo, about Abraham Lincoln, he wrote whatever he wants to about Abraham Lincoln because Abraham Lincoln is dead. If you're going to write about people that are still living, as long as you're not writing something bad defamatory about them, that's okay. But I think, and it's just my advice to you, is that you change the names of those people, that you maybe change their sex, that you work on not having them be readily identifiable. I noticed one thing that Tom Barbash did in his book. Yoko Ono is still alive. He just had a few brief mentions about Yoko Ono. Oh yeah, he saw her in the hallway or something like that. Nothing that was substantive about Yoko Ono, because Yoko Ono is still alive. I think that's about it. And I'd love to answer questions if anybody has a question. Yeah?
Can you talk about the technique you use in writing 2 points of view?
You just have to put yourself in that spot, John Gilbert Graham, he was a horrible guy. You just figure out, what would he see? How would he see this? His wife had just had a child. And by the way, I did change the names of his wife and his children, because he has a daughter that's still alive. There was a daughter that's still alive. But, how is he seeing his wife? He's seeing her as a roadblock in his plan. He sees the kids as, I just worked with that. How is he looking at it? You were looking at it through his eyes. How would what he wears make a difference? How would what he's eating for breakfast, how would that person, what does he want for breakfast as compared to what Hannah does? Hannah's, an outcast at school. How is she looking at school? How is she looking at her friends at school? How is she, how are her classes going? What is she, so you're just like, how is that person looking at the world? What does she eat? What does she like? How does she feel when she gets up in the morning? All those kinds of things that are just making you really, really settle into that person. Whole different thing from what John Gilbert Graham was looking at is what Hannah was looking at. Yeah.
And then how do you stitch them together so they each have their own worlds? do they both see like the same incident from their own points of view?
Absolutely.
Choose who to tell it from and then pick up after that?
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're depending on the viewpoint of your chapter, yeah, or you could have the same event happen, with two different people from two different viewpoints, or your character could be looking at the other character and saying, oh, I can see he doesn't like this, or the dialogue may reflect how the character is feeling about something. All those things can be used to show how one character looks at things differently from the other one, or how, yeah. Hmm?
I was curious about your process when it comes to sensationalism. If there's a meditation that maybe you go through when you're, let's say, you're looking into a subject, and how do you kind of skirt the line between sensationalism versus just reporting the facts, or maybe embellishing here and there? I was just curious about that.
Well, I think that, when I'm a reader, I really want to know a lot. And that was a very difficult for me thing. As a journalist, as a reporter, it was just the facts, ma'am. And you didn't say how you felt about something. If it wasn't absolutely a part of the story, you left it out. And so it was a big shift for me to where I was, okay, what is this person thinking? How does this person feel? All those things that I didn't do when I was a journalist. So it was like almost 180. Okay, how does this person feel? What would this person say? What is this person's background that might have made a difference that I certainly couldn't put in the newspaper? All those things. So it's almost like 180. From all right, we don't want to know how a person feels, and that's still a challenge for me. Is what is this person thinking? How is this person feeling?
Well, just to continue on with this question, so then with regard to the sensationalism, because a lot of what you see on TV and a lot of what you see in the newspaper is all sensationalism. So how do you take all of that sensationalism that you do hear and see and put it in your book, but also give the ways that each of the characters are feeling and what they're thinking?
I have a scene in the book, I don't want to give away too much, but I have a scene in the book where Hannah and her father go out to the crash scene. And it's probably the most difficult scene, was the most difficult scene in the book for me to write. It was a horrendous crash scene, and there are numerous, I read numerous accounts of it. And actually I'm going to the town right next to the crash scene and do an event later on this month. And that was the most sensationalistic part, in many ways. It was a very, very difficult, but it was a horrendous scene. And Hannah continued to think about it. She continued to have bad dreams about it. Even both she and her husband, when they came from, when they got in the car and left the scene, because by that time the police had come in and they were moving all the people that were there, picking up, stuff and trying to see if there were any survivors. At that point, they got in the car and went home, and so her father's crying. And so what I tried to do was to have them be human and have them have human feelings of sorrow and grief about what had happened. And so I think in that way, and that was and that in the arc of the story, that she doesn't forget it, but she recovers from that. So that's kind of how I handled that. That was the most I didn't include anything about Graham's execution. She went, in my book, she went down to visit him in the prison, but I don't include anything about the execution or anything like that. Yeah.
Kind of a different question. When you go about choosing subject matters, something that I've grappled with as a writer, I've been writing my whole life, is my tastes versus maybe the markets, let's call it. Or
Yeah.
how do you navigate that personally? I went through a period where I was very much like, I'm writing whatever I feel like, and whoever shows up, great. But now I'm 180 from that. And it's steering away from trends. It's been a lot more liberating to consider an audience. And I was just curious, like, where you fall on that yourself.
I guess I just write what I want to read about, now that I think about it, most of my stories have a girl or a young woman in them who's kind of the main character. I'm not a person that is interested in vampires. I'm sorry if you read about vampires, but that's not something that that I'm interested in writing about. But you have to be true to yourself too. You have to be true to what it is that draws you and that makes you sit up and say, I want to know more about that, or I want to write about that, or isn't that, whatever it is, amazing? That's what you need to write about. You just need to, and you have to be true to that. Yeah, you have to be true to that. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So I have a question. So you talked about you can't libel dead people, so that's pretty clear. But, if you're including people who are alive, especially who are connected to these kind of events, like you talked about the guy's daughter is still alive, like, do you reach out to those people? How do you, or you just change their name and that's enough, or how do you?
Yeah, I just changed their name, Graham's daughter, last I knew from just a very brief news report, she lives in LA. Her brother got married. They didn't know that this was what happened. They were very young. They didn't know that this had happened until they were out of high school and their mother told them. And he and his wife moved up to Seattle, and one news report said that they disappeared and the police thought that they had possibly been murdered. And whether that's true or not, I tried to track that down, I couldn't. But I just felt that, I just didn't want, I just felt for the girl, and Graham's wife had a brother who's still alive, or was at the time. This is about 7-8 years ago. So I changed the name of his wife and his children. I just thought it was the best thing to do. Yeah.
So you personally knew the family because they went to your church?
I didn't know them.
Oh.
They went to my church. And there are times when I thought, as I was writing the book, I thought, I kind of had this kind of feeling, they could have been sitting right over there, or right over there, or their family could have been sitting in the pew next to us, or, it was that kind of an eerie feeling about it. Yeah.
So you didn't have any, other than maybe sitting next to them, you didn't have any feeling from the family at all, like, oh, those people are a little different, or those people scare me, or anything like that?
No, no. But going to the house, when I went past the house, I found out where the house was that they lived in, and I got a really bad feeling about it. His mother, his mother was on the plane, and he did it for the insurance money. Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. Oh, I said his mother was on the plane, and he did the bombing for the insurance money. Back in those days, there were kiosks at the airport, and you could buy insurance right there at the airport.
I remember that.
Yeah, and after that happened, they took those kiosks out of the airport. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Ann. I'm wondering what was your thinking in not including the execution? Because to me, my thinking was, well, that would be kind of a logical conclusion from it. I'm wondering, what made you not want to put that in?
Well, once Graham was convicted, at that point, Hannah was trying to overcome a lot, and trying to get back to school, trying to sleep at night, all those things. She went down to see Graham right before he was executed in my story, and I guess I thought that it had been enough.
But you did have, so the reader does know that he is executed.
Oh, yeah,
You just
yeah.
didn't go into a...
Yeah, I didn't say,
Blow by blow.
okay, they went and they strapped him down. I didn't do any of that. I just, at that point, he was convicted and Hannah was trying to rebuild her life. And I just didn't feel that would add to it. Yeah. Well, okay, maybe one more.
You mentioned earlier how the difference between reporting and writing was getting into the people's thought process. And you said that was kind of challenging for you, and I was wondering how you say you still struggle with it, but I was wondering how you got yourself into doing it, like how you worked that out.
You know, you guys have critique groups here,
Yeah.
and my critique group would say, you know, I would take my chapter to the critique group, and they would say, I don't have any idea what the character was feeling in this little part. So a critique group is a great way of getting feedback. Okay, all right, yes, I need to work on that part. So I mean, critique group, they really, you know, they really let you know, and in a nice way. You know, in a good way, because they want you to succeed. They want you to succeed. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Have you covered other things in your occupation as a reporter that you may write about?
Well, Bakersfield Boys Club, of course, was one of the ones that I covered that as a reporter and then wrote about it. And it was a series of murders that happened down there in which powerful men were abusing young people. And and those murders were surrounded that. And then I worked at the legislature, and I started a book about politics, but I never finished it at that point. So that one's sitting there, and but I started another one about women's professional basketball, because back then the Monarchs played in Sacramento, and were a super successful Sacramento basketball team. So I started a book about women's professional basketball, and I showed it to an agent who said no one was the least interested in women's basketball. Of course, now everybody's interested in women's basketball. So yeah. Well, thanks, you guys. Yeah, and I'll be back there selling some books if you guys are interested. And it has been so much fun. I do.